Have you ever noticed how after 60, some people slowly start feeling things like constant tiredness, mild bloating, or that heavy, slowed-down feeling in the body? And yet nothing in their daily routine really seems different. And most of the time, it gets brushed off as just normal aging. But here's the uncomfortable part most people don't realize early enough. Sometimes what feels like normal aging is actually the body adapting quietly to something happening underneath the surface. Because kidney stress, especially in the early stages, doesn't usually feel like a clear warning. It doesn't knock you down suddenly. It builds slowly, silently, while everything still seems fine on the outside. And that's where things get a little unsettling, because creatinine levels can start rising in the background long before any obvious symptoms show up in daily life, or even get noticed casually. So the real question becomes this: how often are we actually misunderstanding the signals our body is already giving us? And today, we're going to break down 4 specific foods that may naturally support kidney health after 60. But more importantly, you're going to see something most people completely miss about how kidney strain actually develops over time. And once you understand that pattern, you may never look at healthy eating the same way again. Now this is where things start to get a little uncomfortable, because when kidney health comes up after 60, the advice almost always sounds the same. Drink more water, reduce salt, eat healthy foods, and everything should improve over time. And yet, in real life, many people who are already trying to follow those steps carefully still go for routine tests and get surprised when their creatinine hasn't improved the way they expected. And that creates a question most people don't openly think about. If the basic advice is being followed, but the numbers are still changing slowly, then what part of the picture is actually being missed? Because creatinine isn't something that suddenly spikes out of nowhere. It reflects how your body is handling waste day after day. And the tricky part is, this change doesn't feel dramatic in daily life. There's no clear alarm, no obvious warning. Just subtle shifts, like feeling slightly more tired than before, needing longer to recover after simple activity, or slowly losing that lightness you used to take for granted without even noticing when it changed. And here's the part most people never connect to their own routine. Sometimes the issue isn't one big mistake. It's small, everyday habits that don't feel harmful on their own, but quietly add pressure over time until the system is working harder than it should. And that's exactly why some people only realize something is going on when a simple blood test shows creatinine levels are not where they expected them to be. So before we talk about those 4 foods, you need to understand one important thing first. Because once you see this pattern clearly, it becomes obvious why so many people focus on the wrong part of the problem without even realizing it. Now this is where things start to get a little more confusing for most people. Because on the surface, kidney support sounds simple. Just choose the right foods, avoid the wrong ones, and stay consistent. That's the advice most people hear, and it sounds completely logical. But here's the part that creates the confusion. Even people who follow this advice carefully don't always see the results they expect over time. And when that happens, most people quietly blame themselves. They think maybe they didn't try hard enough, or maybe their condition is just part of aging. But there's another possibility that almost nobody really stops to think about. Because here's something important you need to understand. 2 people can follow the same, kidney-friendly routine, eat similar types of foods, and still end up with very different outcomes. Not because the advice is useless, but because the way the body responds is not always identical from person to person. And this is where you should start paying attention to your own experience. Because if you've ever felt like you're doing the right things but not seeing meaningful change, that's not as rare as it feels. In fact, it's something many people quietly go through, without realizing what's actually happening behind the scenes. Now here's the uncomfortable part. It's not always about doing something wrong, and it's not always about the food itself being bad. Sometimes, it's about how certain patterns of eating interact with a body that has already been under long-term pressure for years, without obvious warning signs. And that's exactly why the next part is important. Because before we get into those 4 foods, you need to understand a hidden pattern most people completely overlook. And once you see it, the idea of kidney-friendly foods starts to look a little different than you might expect. Now, before we move into the 4 foods, I want you to slow down for a moment. Because this is the point where most people accidentally misunderstand everything that comes next. Most videos on kidney health make it sound very simple. Just eat the right foods, avoid the wrong ones, and over time everything improves. And on the surface, that sounds completely reasonable. But here's what starts to create confusion for a lot of people. They try to follow that advice seriously. They make real changes. And yet when they check their results later, the improvement is either very small or not what they expected at all. And when that happens, most people quietly assume one of 2 things. Either they didn't do enough, or the problem is just part of getting older. But there's a third possibility that rarely gets considered, and this is where the real misunderstanding begins. Because the gap between effort and results is often where people start misreading what their body is actually doing. They don't notice small internal changes happening slowly, so they only judge progress based on big, visible differences. And when those don't appear quickly, they think nothing is working. Now here's the uncomfortable part. That assumption can completely change how someone interprets their own progress. Because these foods are not going to behave like instant fixes, and they are not meant to produce obvious short-term results. If someone is expecting that, they will almost always miss the real way support actually builds over time inside the body. So before we go further, reset your expectations properly. Not everything you're about to see works in isolation, and not everything shows its effect in a way you can immediately feel. And once you understand that clearly, the 4 foods we're about to look at will make much more sense, not as a quick solution, but as part of a deeper pattern that most people never recognize while they're trying to improve their kidney health. Now, this first food might actually feel too simple at first. And that's exactly why most people overlook it without even realizing they're doing it. Because when people think about supporting kidney health, they usually imagine something strong, rare, or medically impressive. Something that feels like it should do a lot in a short time. But the body doesn't always respond to intensity. It often responds to small, consistent inputs that quietly reduce pressure over time. And this is where the mistake happens. If something feels too ordinary, people mentally downgrade its importance before they even understand how it fits into the bigger picture. Now here's what makes this first food interesting. It's not that it performs some dramatic function on its own, but that it is often completely underestimated in how it supports the body's daily balance, especially in people who already feel that slow buildup of internal heaviness or fatigue. Because in real-life eating habits, this food is usually treated as something secondary. Something added casually, not something you would ever connect to something like creatinine levels or kidney strain. So it gets mentally ignored, not because it's useless, but because it doesn't look important. But that's exactly where the misunderstanding sits. Because in the background, foods like this are often part of what helps the body stay lighter in its internal load, especially through hydration support and reducing unnecessary strain on the system over time. Not as a treatment, but as a quiet form of daily support that most people never really pay attention to. So the first food is cucumber. But the real point here is not the food itself. It's the realization that some of the most overlooked things in your daily diet are not ineffective. They're just too simple to be taken seriously. And once that idea clicks, you'll start looking at the next food very differently. Because what comes next works in a completely different way inside the body, and that's where things start to get even more interesting. Now, as we move into the second food, I want you to slow down your expectation for a moment. Because after hearing about something as simple and familiar as cucumber, most people naturally assume they already understand how this pattern works. Something light, something supportive, something predictable. But that assumption is exactly where the next shift happens. Because this second food does not fit neatly into the same light support category you just saw. In fact, If you try to interpret it in the same way, you might completely miss why it matters in the first place. Now here's where things get interesting. This is something most people already use regularly in meals, but almost nobody connects it to internal balance in a meaningful way. Not because it's unknown, but because it feels too ordinary to carry any real significance. And that's the first misunderstanding, because when something becomes familiar, the brain stops evaluating its deeper role. It gets labeled as just flavor, just routine, or just basic kitchen use. And once that label is assigned, its potential role in supporting the body is mentally ignored. But here's the part that slightly changes that perspective. This food is garlic. And for a second you might think, that's too simple to matter in a discussion like this. And that reaction itself is exactly the point. Because what most people miss is not the food, but the way it behaves differently compared to the first one. Cucumber was about gentle, surface-level support, something that quietly helps with hydration balance and light internal ease. But garlic works on a different internal response layer. It is associated with how the body manages deeper everyday stress signals and internal pressure patterns that build up over time. And the important shift here is not the food itself. It's realizing that two completely ordinary foods can operate in completely different ways inside the same system. Now pause on that for a second, because if that idea is true, then it means the mistake most people make is not ignoring bad foods, but misunderstanding how ordinary foods function at different levels. And now that this second layer is clear, the next food is going to shift the pattern again in a way that most people don't expect, because it introduces a completely different type of support mechanism altogether. Now as we move into the third food, something subtle is starting to happen, because by this point, you're no longer just hearing individual foods, you're starting to notice a pattern forming. Each one seems to connect to a different layer of how the body manages internal balance over time. And once that pattern starts forming in your mind, you naturally begin to pay closer attention, because now it feels less like a list and more like a system. But this third food is where things start to feel slightly more personal. Because unlike the first two, this one is often connected to how people feel day to day. Things like low energy, a heavier body sensation, or that subtle feeling of not being as refreshed as before, even when nothing major in their routine has changed. And most people don't connect those small shifts to anything specific. They just accept them as normal aging. Now here's where the perception starts to shift. This food is not overlooked because it's rare. It's overlooked because it feels too familiar to matter. Something you've seen your entire life. Something that never seems important enough to take seriously in a health context. And that's exactly why it gets mentally dismissed. Because the brain tends to assign importance based on appearance and expectation, not actual internal effect. And this is where the pattern becomes clearer again. Because if cucumber felt like light surface support, and garlic felt like a deeper internal response layer, then this third food connects more to how the body manages ongoing internal strain, the kind that builds slowly and shows up as how heavy or light you feel throughout the day. So the third food is spinach. And if that feels almost too simple to be meaningful, that reaction is exactly the same reason most people underestimate it. Because spinach isn't interesting because it is rare or powerful looking. It's interesting because it quietly fits into a pattern of daily support that only becomes obvious when you start paying attention to long-term changes instead of immediate effects. And now at this point, something important is happening. Because the more you see these differences, the more obvious it becomes that kidney support isn't about one type of food. It's about how different foods interact with different layers of internal pressure, energy, and balance in everyday life. And now the final food is where everything starts to come together in a way most people don't expect. Because it doesn't just add another layer, it reframes the entire pattern you've been building so far. Now we've reached the fourth and final food. But before we name it, I want you to slow down for a moment, because this is the point where most people naturally switch into list mode, and stop thinking deeply about what they're actually hearing. And if that happens, they miss the real message completely. Because by now, something should already be forming in your mind. This was never really about 4 separate foods. It was about a much more subtle idea, that the body doesn't respond to health in one single action, but through small, repeated inputs that either reduce pressure over time or slowly add to it without being noticed. And this final food might actually feel too simple to deserve attention. Not because it's rare, not because it's powerful, but because it's the kind of thing people see every day and mentally classify as too basic to matter. And once something gets that label, most people stop thinking any deeper about it. But that label is exactly where the misunderstanding begins. Because while the earlier foods were connected to different layers of internal balance, hydration, response patterns, and daily energy stability, this final one connects to something even more overlooked: how consistency in simple habits quietly influences how steady the body feels over long periods of time. So the fourth food is apples. And if your first reaction is something like, "That's it," or "That's too simple," that reaction is actually more important than the food itself, because it reflects exactly how most people judge support in general. They expect something strong, immediate, and noticeable, when in reality, the body often responds most consistently to the opposite. And here's where everything comes together in a more honest way. The real takeaway isn't that these 4 foods are special on their own. It's that most people underestimate how much their daily patterns, what they repeatedly eat without thinking, shape how their body feels over time. And maybe the most important realization from all of this is not about adding something new. It's about finally noticing what you've been overlooking for a long time, without even realizing it. Now, before you completely close this video, there's one last thing you really need to understand, because knowing these foods is only part of the picture. The way people use them in real life is often where the entire benefit gets reduced without them even realizing it. Because here's what usually happens. When people hear about kidney-supportive foods, they don't introduce them gradually. They try to fix everything at once. They overload their meals, change their routine overnight, and expect a noticeable difference in a very short time. But the body doesn't respond well to that kind of sudden pressure, especially when it has already been dealing with long-term strain. And that's where the real misunderstanding sits. People often assume that doing more automatically leads to better results. But in reality, the body responds more clearly to consistency than intensity. Not because effort doesn't matter, but because internal systems usually need time to adjust, not force. So instead of trying to force all 4 foods into every meal or expecting immediate change, the more realistic approach is much simpler. Start small, stay consistent, and let your body respond naturally over time instead of rushing the process. Because if there's one idea this entire video should leave you with, it's this. It's rarely one big decision that changes how your body feels. It's the small things you repeat without much attention that slowly shape the direction you're going in, without loud signals and without immediate feedback. And once you really understand that, even simple foods stop feeling simple in the way they used to. They start feeling like part of a pattern you either support or ignore over time. And with that in mind, the real takeaway from all of this is not just what to eat, but how easily we underestimate the power of what we repeat every single day. Now, as we reach the end of everything we've discussed, I want you to step back for a moment. Because if you look at this from a slightly wider angle, you'll realize this was never really just about 4 foods for kidney support. It was about something most people overlook until much later than they should. Because in real life, changes in things like creatinine rarely come from one sudden mistake. They build slowly, through everyday habits that feel completely normal at the time. Nothing extreme, nothing obvious, just repetition over time. And that's exactly why so many people don't notice anything until a routine test suddenly shows a different result. But here's what really matters. Your body is never not responding. It's always reacting in the background to patterns, what you repeatedly eat, how consistently you support your system, and how much quiet pressure builds over time without you realizing it. And once that clicks, something important shifts. It's no longer about searching for the perfect food or the fastest solution. It becomes about noticing the small choices you repeat every day without thinking, and whether those choices are gradually helping your system stay balanced or slowly adding pressure to it. So if there's one thing to take away from this video, let it be this simple shift in awareness. Stop looking for single answers to long-term changes. Start paying attention to patterns that repeat quietly in the background of your daily life. Because in most cases, that's where the real difference is actually happening, long before you ever notice it.